Today, I have the honor of introducing you to Professor Susi Geiger. And Susi is full professor of Markets, Organizations and Society at UCD Smurfit School of Business. And I will speak to her about peak pharma, why the pharmaceutical industry has to change. Welcome, Susi.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you so much for having me invited to this inaugural meeting of this series. I'm really, really honored by that.
And we're delighted to have you, Susi. And first question today, please let me start with you. So your work is so impressive and so interdisciplinary. Could you please tell the audience what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Patricia, I'm passionate about healthcare, and I'm hugely passionate about equality. Essentially, what I want to put my energies towards is ensuring that everyone in the world can get their right to access healthcare as and when they need it. To be honest, we're still quite a long way away from that. So this mission not only fuels my academic work, but also my work as a World Health Organization expert member of the Technical Advisory Group on Pharmaceutical Pricing Policies, and my deep involvement in Access to Medicines Ireland, which is an NGO here in Ireland that advocates for health equity everywhere.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susi. And so you've been leading out over the last number of years an ERC research project called Misfires, and that's built around the need to address market failures in healthcare. Maybe you could give our audience a very quick overview on this project.
So Misfires, as you say, has examined market failures in healthcare, and then importantly, it's also reflected on what can be done to make these markets better for those who are affected by them. And I give you two short examples of the kind of work that we've been looking at and of the kind of things that I would call market failures. The first is a global one. The second is a little bit closer to home. So first, the global one. During the pandemic, if you remember back, nobody wants to remember back, but if you do, in January 2022, we were all queuing up for our third booster vaccine here in Ireland and everywhere else in the high-income world, whereas in a lot of lower and middle-income countries, even healthcare workers hadn't received their first vaccination. So they were going into COVID wards without any protection at all. That had two reasons. First of all, because our policymakers had decided that they would advance purchase a lot of the supply of COVID-19 vaccines, but also because the manufacturers themselves had patented these medicines, so they couldn't be produced in mass by other manufacturers. And that created these huge supply chain issues and this global inequity worldwide. So the second example of a market failure in healthcare is one that really affects us all now in Ireland, which is we have just earlier this year in January, the government agreed to reimburse a drug called Livmeldy, which is a very important drug for a rare disease, but it came onto the market at a price point of about 3 million per patient. Now, the problem wasn't that drug, but it was that Livmeldy came after Luxturna and Zolgensma and Yescarta and Kymriah. All of these are drugs that are coming on the market at about €1 million per patient for treatment. There are 500 of these high-tech innovative medicines in development at the moment. And it's very simple. Healthcare systems can't afford these high-tech drugs. They can't afford these kinds of prices. And we have to find a way out.
Okay. Wow. I am sure I have so many questions for you. I'm sure our audience does too. So please do remember to submit your questions via the chat functions at the bottom of your screen. And Susi, just before you and I finish up, so you've a new book coming out early in 2025, and it's entitled, I better get this right, Peak Pharma, Why We Need a New Political Economy of Pharmaceuticals. So firstly, huge congratulations. That's amazing. And secondly, can you tell our audience just a little bit about this book?
Absolutely. So this book is partly historical. It traces the development of the pharmaceutical industry over the past 40 years and all the crises that it has given rise to along the way. But then it's also forward-looking, more importantly, maybe. In the last few chapters, we draw up two scenarios, a dystopian one and a utopian one for where our global healthcare system could be going. And finally, we make suggestions to policymakers to ensure that we're going down the utopian path rather than the dystopian path. So really quickly, what we see as the dystopian healthcare future that could lie in waiting is a fully privatized or pretty much fully privatized system where these very high-tech innovative drugs are available to only those few select people who can afford them. So a concierge type system, and that would create huge inequalities, not just globally, but also within the countries themselves. Because essential medicines might just not be available anymore, or they might be neglected in terms of the innovation. So we don't want that system. We want a utopian one. We want one where there is a very lively innovation ecosystem in pharmaceuticals at all levels. But that ecosystem, in my opinion, cannot rely on a private industry only. It really has to draw in all the different actors, public research, academic researchers, university hospitals. We're moving so fast towards gene therapies, and they move closer to the bedside, to the patients themselves. So hospitals, innovators in hospitals have a huge role to play in this new ecosystem. So this is what we see as the utopian one, a very diverse ecosystem of healthcare.
Okay, so there's so many questions coming in from the audience, and there's one, I suppose, around your last point there, Susie, because I have so many questions, I'm sure our audience do, so please do remember, submit them. But there's one around, this idea of pricing mass market drugs versus blockbusters. And so it's asking the question, how can we ensure fair access while incentivizing innovation? So you've touched on it, but what are your thoughts around that, Susie?
So, we've argued for the longest time, we've argued with pharmaceutical industry representatives about the cost of innovation and the prices of innovation. I always look at it as sort of 3 tiers. So there's generics, generic medicines on the one hand, and there we just have to ensure that we have robust, resilient supply chain systems. We're seeing huge drug shortages at the moment. I think, the highest level of drug shortages and stockouts in living memory, and we can't have that. We need essential drugs for cancer, antibiotics, etc., guaranteed. So this is the first level. Generic medicines, focus on supply chains and focus on making sure that these markets aren't hijacked by rogue operators. Then the second tier of sort of mass market medicines, innovative medicines like Ozempic and Wegovy at the moment. And if you look into the States, they're selling Ozempic, I read a figure at 40,000% markup. So there's a recent calculation that you could, at a profit, sell Ozempic at, I think, 89 cents a dose. So we just have to keep check on these prices. We have to make sure that the patents are narrow enough, that these patents don't get evergreened as a lot of industry try to do, and that policymakers are strong enough in that area just to keep prices in check. And then we need to also focus on this sort of last tier of highly innovative medicines where these really, big ticket prices come in. And as I say, that just needs a complete rethink of the ecosystem, because that's not where the pharmaceutical industry really plays very well.
Yeah, and so this is just, you're shocking me with some of your figures there. One question coming in from Matthew Meon, I hope I pronounced your name properly, is when talking about supply chain issues, Susie, what can the HSC do to guarantee supply of medicines that are necessary for some rare diseases, for example, or can be for cystic fibrosis?
Yeah, so I mean, there's 2 issues here. First of all, it's, Orkambi is one of these highly innovative therapies, but there's also a supply chain issue. I think it's for the HSE, it's a really difficult task, because they're looking at the entire portfolio of drugs, and they're looking at those 3 tiers, and they have to negotiate a relatively finite budget between those 3 tiers. And obviously they want that all Irish patients have access to the most innovative drugs, and we're actually behind. So if you take sort of I think there's 167, innovative high-tech drugs registered with the European Medicines Agency at the moment. Ireland only has access on the market, reimbursed access to 47 of them. So we have a long way to go to catch up. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer, but I think, a portfolio approach to really make sure that all of these three tiers are looked at, together, but also in differentiated manners. Where is the need in each of these tiers? So how can we ensure that generic manufacturers get at least enough money so that they don't pull out of the country, or they manufacture enough medicines for everybody's needs in the mass market, ensuring that we keep those prices in check, which will then allow us to subsidize that highest tier of highly innovative medicines.
Yeah, so you were saying this kind of ecosystem of players to actually ensure this equity across. So, and if you're thinking about drugs for neglected diseases, for example, so who are those players? Are there any players in Ireland? Are there any players globally that we should be supporting in those particular aspects?
Absolutely. And again, global equity being huge here. And it's a very important issue, Patricia. So again, neglected tropical diseases isn't an area where the pharmaceutical industry plays very well at. I think, figures have shown that only about between 1% and 4% of all pharmaceutical R&D is dedicated to neglected diseases. But we have NGOs that actually do that. So there's an outfit called Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, DNDI. And for the last 20 years, they've actually done the R&D on the most neglected tropical diseases together in the countries and together with the countries where these drugs are needed, and made sure that these drugs are delivered to, the end of the pavement, as they call it, to the people who actually need them. And we have to globally, in high income countries, we have to absolutely support these initiatives. We have to support NGOs that do really tremendously important work in this area.
It's incredible work, and I'd actually never heard of them. That's really interesting. And to go back to innovation, this idea of where is the innovation taking place, Susie? Is it taking place in pharma? Where is the innovation taking place?
It's actually quite interesting because we kind of assume that it's pharma who does all the innovation. But if you look at the US, for instance, so the National Institutes of Health, the big healthcare pharmaceutical funder there, they actually they take care of about 30% of all pharmaceutical R&D. So it's even in the most sort of privatized system, like in the US, a very large chunk of pharmaceutical R&D is done by public institutions, or funded, or at least part funded by public institutions. It's done in academic institutions. Then the question becomes one of how can we make sure that we put conditionalities on this funding, on this investment by the public, that these drugs actually see the light of the market at the end of the day. There are markets for them, and that they're not overpriced. So okay. I think, sort of having a sort of a much more value chain perspective is also important for policymakers, and not just sort of outsourcing all the R&D to private players. I just don't think we can afford that anymore.
Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi just broke up there. I apologize. So there's a question in from Philip Ryan, and it says, is there a requirement or place for state non-market pharmaceutical production? I think we talked about that already, maybe through the NGOs. And if there's anything else you want to add, please do.
Yes,
but then
Philip,
he asked the second question, is health yes. Yeah. So is health a public good? So two questions in that.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a right to have access to healthcare. It's enshrined in the Constitution of the World Health Organization. It is a public good. And I think it's also important to realize that you know, a lot of people actually don't need much support to attain health. They need clean water, sanitation, and access to nutritious food, you know. And as a society, I also think if we think about the pharmaceutical industry, we also have to think about the healthcare system in which they are embedded. And again, you know, when we think about how to distribute our investment as taxpayers, as the public, then let's make sure that these socioeconomic bases are covered before we think about anything else, really.
It's a fantastic way of looking at it, Susie. And you know, there's a question coming in around taxpayers paying maybe twice for certain drugs. I don't know, want to comment on that very quickly?
That was the typical example, was actually during the pandemic. Moderna and BioNTech both got anywhere between 1.5 and 2.5 billion R&D support, both during the pandemic and before. So it wasn't just private investment that made these COVID vaccines possible. And then the vaccines came on the market, and we paid between 20 and 30 euros per shot for those vaccines. So already we paid twice. Now, the danger with that is that we might be paying thrice because these mRNA patents have been deliberately given out in a very sort of broad manner. But now those mRNA markets, there could be, you know, markets for HIV vaccines, for cancer, for all sorts of wonderful things. But they're in the hands of a few private companies now. And that makes me worried, to be honest.
So let's end on a positive note, Susie, if we can. In terms
yes,
of...
please. So I think, you know, there's so much.
You know, you talked, how can we ensure that?
So there's so much fantastic development happening. You know, gene and cell therapies, personalized medicines, they have the potential to revolutionize, especially diseases that we just hadn't had any medications for such a long time. Rare diseases, rare cancers, all sorts of things. You know, HIV vaccines, a lot of people still dying of HIV, actually. Let's make sure they're accessible to everybody who needs them. That's my mission in life, Patricia.
That would be incredible. And unfortunately, we are completely out of time. So sincere apologies to all of you who questions I didn't get to, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Susie for the most fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for having me, and thank you everybody for listening in.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening in, and we'll see you all very soon on the next UCD Hit series. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely day. Take care. Thank you. Thanks, Susie. That was amazing. And there's some lovely thanks coming in already from people in the audience. So thank you.